Starting with news from Hong Kong, the crackdown on the democratic opposition is intensifying after a marathon bail hearing was adjourned. Overnight, dozens of Hong Kong democracy activists are back in court today. Normally, such a bail hearing might take little more than a couple of hours, but the broadly worded legal vagaries of the security law, which removes the presumption of bail for non-violent crimes, made the court struggle. Now, the court sat on and off for some 15 hours throughout Monday as the prosecution called for the activists to be held in custody until the next 3 months while the defense tried to pursue bail. An adjournment only came in the small hours of Tuesday morning after one of the defendants, Clarice Young, collapsed and was rushed to hospital. 3 other defendants were subsequently taken to hospital in ambulances. About 1,000 supporters gathered outside West Kowloon courthouse. The crowd chanted slogans such as "Liberate Hong Kong, Revolution of Our Times," with many dressed in black. On Sunday, 47 pro-democracy activists and lawmakers were detained on charges of conspiracy. Organizers of an unofficial primary election were accused by Chinese authorities of being a key tactician for the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. More than 47 other Democrats were arrested in January, a 6th raid. Dozens, including former lawmakers and democracy advocates, were arrested the same day. American lawyer John Clancy was the first foreigner to be arrested in connection with Hong Kong's new national security law. That said, he continued to fight to build a better society in Hong Kong. Other lawmakers had similar sentiments. The primary poll was intended to help select candidates for the Legislative Council election scheduled for September 2020. Hong Kong authorities and pro-Beijing politicians have claimed that the primary election was a form of subversion which is outlawed by the national security law. Meanwhile, China's foreign ministry has said that it supports the Hong Kong police over charges of subversion leveled against dozens of activists. He said that China has urged the US to respect facts, respect the legal system, and stop interfering in Hong Kong affairs in any way. And for more on this, right now we're joined by a WION correspondent, Richard Kimber from Hong Kong. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, 3 defendants had to be rushed to the hospital. The court sat on and off for about 15 hours. The whole situation seems pretty chaotic. Can you just walk us through the events of the day?
That's right. The events have really gotten back into motion just as of this morning. Some of those defendants have barely had more than a couple of hours rest since they were finally taken from the court back to where they were being detained before then being brought back to the courthouse this morning. So lots of controversy here about the way this case is being handled. Many of the defence lawyers accusing the prosecution of entering this effectively in a half-baked state, not really having prepared the prosecution properly, and with so many people facing trial at the same time, they say it simply wasn't possible for the prosecution to carry this out in an effective manner, and for that reason they suggested this should never have been brought to trial so soon in the first place. So a great deal of criticism being levied at the prosecution here, and pressure on the prosecution to try and sort out how to deal with this in a more effective manner. As you say, this went into the early hours of this morning, and some of those defendants ended up being taken to hospital. Also, further complications because some of those defendants were also facing separate charges that were also being tried today in separate courts. So it's becoming increasingly complicated. The more people being arrested here, the more charges that are being levied under the national security law, the more difficult it's becoming for the courts to try and handle the sheer number of people who are being tried.
Do you think it's almost strategic in a way to have this happen so soon so that such a situation would arise?
Well, there are criticisms specifically being levied at the Department of Justice and the prosecution for arresting and charging these people earlier than they were expecting to be charged. They were, many of them, due to be on bail until April, but the charges actually came somewhat unexpectedly at the weekend, pushing forward this court process and effectively causing the situation that we're in now. One of the criticisms is based around the fact that exactly at this moment over the border in Shenzhen in southern China, just about an hour from here, there are also high-level political deliberations taking place about how to reform the electoral structure in Hong Kong. There are fears from democracy campaigners what could happen is the entire electoral system in Hong Kong will be changed somewhat more in favour of the pro-Beijing establishment. And the fact that these two things are happening at the same time, that you have so many high-profile activists being detained right now because of this court proceedings, is one of the reasons that pro-democracy activists who are not yet in court are very angry, and that's why they've been organising for people to come out and campaign outside the courthouse.
All right, and also like I mentioned earlier, Hong Kong authorities and pro-Beijing politicians have claimed that the primary elections were a form of subversion which is outlawed by the national security law. What can you tell us about that?
Well, their concern really is not necessarily the actual primaries themselves, but the intent behind the primaries. They've accused those who are organising these unofficial primary polls that it was all part of a bigger scheme that they had in mind to try and get a majority in the legislature, and then, and crucially then, to try and overturn deliberately every single piece of government legislation, including crucially the government's budget, to veto that budget when it was announced. That, they say, would be an act of subversion. And so what they've done is they've linked this end goal, if you like, to everything that went before it, and therefore said that holding these unofficial primaries is also an act of subversion. The reason that many of the campaigners are angry about that is because they say that this is part of Hong Kong's constitution to have primary polls like this, and that it was nothing more than an effort to try and help the public understand who to choose when it came to picking from the many pro-democracy candidates who were due to stand in that election. That election, of course, never took place in September. It was postponed until this coming September, controversially by the government because of COVID-19 health concerns.
All right, Richard, also what can you tell us about the way forward? What do you think is the plan of action now?
Well, talking to some of the campaigners yesterday, including the chairman of the Democratic Party, probably the best organised of all of the pro-democracy groups, he said that irrespective of what happens in this court case, he's determined to keep campaigning. Of course, that's going to be more difficult because some of his senior colleagues as pro-democracy campaigners are inside the court right now, waiting to await their fate. But many of the people on the street yesterday still determined to keep coming out, even in defiance of police threats yesterday that they themselves may also be arrested under the national security law for gathering in large numbers and chanting slogans, some of which have now been banned by the national security law itself. So there's still very much an effort to show frustration on the part of the public, but really with so many people in court and so many people going through this national security law arrest process, it's increasingly difficult to imagine that this pro-democracy movement can gather any momentum beyond the international attention that it's gathering, and that's where they're focusing their efforts, trying to get more international pressure from the likes of the US, the UK and the European Union.
All right, Richard, thank you so much for joining us with all those inputs. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.